The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 8, verses 18 to 27. Now when Jesus saw great multitudes about him, he gave commandment to depart unto the other side. And a certain scribe came and said unto him, Master, I will follow thee whithersoever thou goest. And Jesus saith unto him, The foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. And another of his disciples said unto him, Lord, suffer me first to go and bury my father. But Jesus said unto him, Follow me, and let the dead bury the dead. And when he was entered into a ship, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great tempest in the sea, insomuch that the ship was covered with the waves. But he was asleep. And his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, Lord, save us, we perish. And he saith unto them, Why are ye fearful, O ye of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. But the men marveled, saying, What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. In the previous reading from chapter 8 of Matthew, we witnessed Jesus healing a multitude in Capernaum just after sunset, the end of a Sabbath day, and news spreading through Capernaum of the great healing, the leper, the centurion's servant, coming to the house of Simon where Jesus was staying for healing. Now, immediately after those verses, here in chapter 8 of Matthew, we here have Jesus departing, probably in a fishing boat, across the Sea of Galilee from the northwestern side to the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. And just a comment to make before we look at this reading, which is just the order of events here compared to other Gospels. So the Gospel we have covered so far in the Gospel year is that of Mark, and that scene of the healing in the evening time occurred right at the beginning, really, of the ministry of Jesus, as said in the Gospel of Mark. And then there would be a series of events involving other healings and disputation with Pharisees, until in chapter 4 of Mark we come to this scene where Jesus departs from Capernaum by ship. Here in Matthew, it's occurring, it feels directly after the healing of the multitude outside of Simon's house. It probably isn't, though. It's probably after some days, and it's just not mentioned here in Matthew. And that's just an issue that we have to live with, is that the Gospels, although all telling the same story and having a very, very high degree of agreement between them, do have some subtle differences. Particularly John, of course, not being one of the three synoptic Gospels, but even amongst Matthew, Mark and Luke, there are subtle differences with order of events. And it may just be differences in recollections of the eyewitnesses, one of the 12 disciples who are helping the author compile the Gospel. Here with the Gospel of Matthew, that could indeed be Matthew himself or someone working with Matthew. In any case, it is some short time after the healing in Capernaum, and Jesus essentially is exhausted and being mobbed. And so he says to his disciples, we have to take a break because I'm exhausted. And they enter into a fishing boat, most likely, and go across the Sea of Galilee. Now, prior to them entering the boat, there are two individuals that come to Jesus with essentially requests. The first is a scribe. So this would be someone who essentially is very much involved in the legal detail of the scriptures. The scribes generally had a great deal of conflict with Jesus, but we have a scribe here who, perhaps witnessing the Sermon on the Mount, witnessing the healing, is a convert essentially, and wants to join the group that follows Jesus and says, "Master, I will follow thee whithersoever thou goest." And the answer that Jesus gives him is a bit enigmatic. He essentially says that even the animals and the birds have a home, but that he, Jesus, the Son of Man, as he refers to himself, has no home, has nowhere even to lay his head. And he's really dampening the expectations of this scribe as to the meaning of discipleship. He's really telling him this is a life of hardship. There is no earthly glory that comes from following me. The glory will be in heaven. We don't know how that scribe took that information on board. This little exchange is quite reminiscent of the more famous exchange of the rich young man who comes to Jesus just before he enters into Jerusalem and asks him about the nature of goodness and the nature of perfection, essentially. And that's when we have the lesson of the difficulty of a rich man entering the kingdom of heaven. The great difficulty that Jesus very honestly and clearly lays out to people in truly following him. And here we have another of the disciples. We don't know if it's one of the 12 or one of the outer circle of disciples that's gathering around Jesus. And at this point in Matthew, we're not even sure that we have all 12, really. In fact, we know we don't, because we have not yet seen Matthew himself being essentially brought on board by Jesus. That happens in the next chapter. In any case, someone possibly from the outer circle of this new gathering of disciples comes to Jesus and says, "Jesus, Master, I want to follow you, but I need to bury my father." So his father either is on the point of death or has just died. And in Jewish custom, burials normally took place on the day of death, and it was very important particularly for sons, to be present at the burial. But the answer to Jesus is very stark, very stark. Jesus says to him, "Follow me." In other words, there is no time to bury your father. Following me is more important. The work, the holy work that we have to do with the gospel is the most important work, and I'm leaving now. And if you don't come with me, I'm paraphrasing, or rather providing context here. If you don't follow me now, maybe you'll never catch up with me again, because we don't know necessarily what the nature of events is. So you've got to come. And this phrase that has entered into our lexicon in English, "and let the dead bury the dead." An extraordinary set of words, "and let the dead bury the dead." And in some commentaries I've read, the interpretation is something along the lines perhaps of those dead in spirit burying the dead, if the work of Christ is not so important. Otherwise, of course, it is tremendous importance to pay homage to one's dear ones that have passed. So this sounds very stark. Again, we have to be slightly cautious that in all of these encounters that we have with Jesus through the gospel, they are snapshots, and we don't really know what perhaps the 2 minutes of conversation were prior to these famous lines occurring. And so the starkness may not be truly representative of the nature of the interaction. We know Jesus loved his disciples, had compassion for them and for people around him, but he also was quite tough on his disciples at times because he had to toughen them up for what lay ahead. And we saw that through the Gospel of Mark, the number of times that the disciples stumbled and Jesus never gave up on them. He would be very clear about their failings, their weakness, but he would lift them up again, always, even at the very end with the great failure, sadly, of Simon Peter. And now they enter probably the fishing boat, so it would not be a large vessel, and his disciples followed him. And later in that voyage, the great storm arose on the Sea of Galilee. And although the Sea of Galilee is an inland sea, sometimes referred to as a lake, although it's many miles across, because of its placement surrounded by mountains, and also it's very, very low, it's several hundred feet below sea level, it would be exposed to the funneling of great winds, and so storms could arise on the Sea of Galilee very, very suddenly and can be quite strong and potentially destructive to fishing vessels. And here such a storm has arisen, and because Jesus needed for them to leave Capernaum because of sheer exhaustion with the multitudes, possibly after a number of days of healing, he is fast asleep in the stern of the ship, as we learn from Mark, on a pillow indeed, as we learn from Mark. And we have to recognize that Jesus, as the Son of God, in his ministry, first of all refers to himself as the Son of Man, and we talked much about that in Mark, my interpretation of that being that he did not want to announce himself as the Messiah at the outset because of the reaction of the multitudes to that, which would be essentially to crown him and make him a king, and that was the antithesis of his ministry. But also to recognize that Jesus had both a spiritual and an earthly form. He was flesh and blood on earth, and would need sustenance and would need occasional rest from his extraordinarily intense ministry. So here he is, fast asleep in the stern of the ship, not bothered or cognizant of the storm. And his disciples come to him and wake him, saying, "Lord, save us. We're perishing." The storm is so severe, water coming into the boat, they're at risk of the boat capsizing. Jesus says to them, "O ye of little faith, why are ye fearful?" And it can only be that he's saying ye of little faith in the sense of, because I'm on board, you should not be afraid, because of course sailors have every need to be afraid when they're in great danger in storms. They've got to take very, very quick and expert action to avoid capsizing the ship. So this must be because he is on board, and they must recognize that he has some divine nature. So in a way he's saying, "Ye of little faith in me, your master." But they did not expect him, or perhaps even believe that he could do what he then did, which was to stand in the ship and rebuke the winds and the sea. In Mark the words are, "Peace, be still," he says, just as he speaks to the unclean spirits in individuals. Just a few words and total command, and here the storm settles, and there's a great calm, a great calm. We can imagine almost like a mirror-like surface on the Sea of Galilee. What an extraordinary thing that would be to witness. And I think it did instill some fearfulness in those mortal men around. And it's interesting here that Matthew says men, so perhaps there are others in addition to the disciples, perhaps people helping with sailing the vessel. But those on board marveled, "What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" And so an entirely new dimension of the divine power of Jesus Christ is manifested to them, that he can command indeed the elements.